The way that we take pictures on when we start is like this. It's super flat, okay? So what I want to try to activate for myself and for you guys is a sense of depth, a sense of what we're working with here is we're working with a really 2D feeling and process. And what we want to do is we want to move into a world of 3D, okay? Now I think that there are 4 basic tools that can be applied, and their application happens kind of over and over again. And it's the practice of these tools which makes it so that we're not just drawing this person, but we're drawing the space all around the person, okay? So the first tool comes up with atmosphere. And the way to think about this tool is that when you're looking into the distance, say this is a person here, and they're looking this way, it's as though they're looking through sheets of glass. And as they look through the sheets of glass, a couple of different things happen. The level of detail goes from here, you've got a lot of detail, and here you have less, and here you have less. And as it goes on, it becomes less. Okay, it just becomes less and less detailed. By the time you get to be 3 miles away, which you can still kind of vaguely make out, you're not seeing detail. Okay? So when we're drawing something, like let's say we're drawing a basic mountain range like this. Say there's a mountain, and we're drawing a tree that's up and over the mountain. We'll say it's on the other side of the mountain, and it's right here. Okay? Now, we might see in this tree here that there's light that's making this tree be, just like we're seeing that we can see this level of detail in that tree. Now let's say that there's a mountain range further back, like here, okay? And let's put a tree back here. Now let's say this tree is so far back that we can no longer see that it has a light and a dark side, and it just fades into medium. Now let's take a tree and bring it into the foreground. Now this tree, as we split from background to foreground, not only are we going to see that there's light and dark, but the shapes of the light and dark are going to start to become more intricate or more detailed. And so because this is made up of leaves, the shape of the light will start to become this really complicated shape. And the other thing that we might run into is that the shadow value here is more complicated than the shadow value here. Like here, we'll have a core shadow. We're going to use our leaf details to turn us into halftone, to turn us through halftones, and that can be reflected light. And on this edge, you can also have real development of leaves. So this takes this tree, it brings it really close to us. And this takes this tree, it puts it in the mid distance, and it takes that tree and it drops it deep into the background. What we did was we lessened our detail. Now another thing that happens as you move back in space is contrast lessens, right? So detail is one way that we can show distance. Contrast is another way that we can show distance. So for instance, this guy is really dark at the turn, at the transition from light to shadow. There's a real darkness. And then out here, it's really light, where it becomes like absolutely light. And here, you see it's not as dark, and the light, we could even start to fade it just a little bit. And then here, it's much less. It's much less dark and much less light. So we've got detail changes as you go into the distance, and also value changes as you go into the distance. So another thing that changes as you go into the distance is a sense of dimensionality. Okay, so in the foreground, notice how this looks really 3D? How I've got like one side, two sides, and then you could even come further into the foreground. Like there could be a tree that's right here that's going out of the picture, and now in this tree, we could really push for 3D sensibility on it, right? Like this could be a branch that's moving around like this. In certain moments coming towards us, in certain moments going away from us. So by using these shapes here, these circle shapes, these cross contour lines, by taking this branch and putting it on the side of this branch that's facing towards us, I'm creating a real 3D sensibility in the deep foreground here. I could draw leaves on this that have more than one side. So the leaf detail from close, as opposed to this leaf detail, as opposed to this leaf detail, we can really get a sense of this tree in the foreground as a 3D object, and textured and detailed and rich. Whereas this one becomes far more suggested. It's a much more simply suggested object, okay? So we've got detail, value, and dimensionality as keys to moving things forward. Now, I was working with a student, and she was kind of struggling with this like foreground, midground, background idea, and I came up with this idea of a way for us to work together. I asked her to go like this, to take one, two, three, okay? And take these as pieces of glass and stack them so that we could try to have a drawing that shows a foreground, a midground, and a background based on these things. That also calls to mind the last piece, scale is the last piece. Notice that the scale of this one is bigger than the scale of that one, is bigger than the scale of that one. So scale also starts to create distance. So let's try this. Imagine that we're going to look at ones in the foreground, twos in the midground, and threes in the background. And so what we might do is start our threes deep in the background, like this. And before I get too carried away, I'm going to start to introduce some twos. And so the twos could be like this. I could make the twos bigger. And I could start to introduce some dimensionality to the two. And some of them, it's nice to have these overlaps. Overlaps are a good tool. At the point of overlap, scale becomes really nice and obvious. And now let's introduce ones. And on the one, I'm going to put dimensionality. Okay, and here's another one. Oops. See how this starts to create a composition that's moving into space? And we could take that, if you wanted to think about it more abstractly, like we can put circles in the deep background. And we could put bigger circles moving into the foreground, midground, and then we could start to handle the foreground. And this starts to build a nice sense of space. Trying to occupy the midground a little more, with a little more stable, a little more stability in the midground. Okay? So I'm just doing small things, these basic 4 tricks. We basically have scale, dimensionality, which we're seeing here, dimensionality, value, and contrast becoming less as the thing goes into space. And all of this leaves, there's one other tool really for dropping things, for getting things to go into deep space, and that's the use of lines that are essentially orthogonals. Like, so a classic tool is like this. This is an orthogonal in perspective. And this line here has a tendency to walk us into the depths of the picture. We'll kind of follow it deep into interesting situations, interesting places in the picture. Like, for instance, the place between these two blocks has a certain level of, creates a certain kind of curiosity. A classic move in a landscape you see in landscape photography, and a very classic move is the use of a road that curls inward. You can see it diminishing in size as it goes backward into the picture. And this very quickly introduces a sense of depth. Something more urban. You might have a road passing through this way. And in the foreground, there could be an insinuation of a bridge, like you could have a bridge shape. And there might be a sign on the bridge here, like sometimes bridges have signs. And now in the distance, there could be another bridge. But this time we see the entire bridge, but we've reduced its scale. And that bridge could also have a little sign on it. So the sign in the foreground might be really dark. And in the background it would be less dark. But we reduced the scale. We've got this road going back, and we've reduced the scale of the bridge. You could have a little sign right here. And then as the piece disappears, as it goes back in the distance, there could be more signs. There could be one right here that's a little bit smaller. Okay? And so we're pushing into the distance of this picture. Okay. Hope that stuff's useful.